take a deep breath. The fact that our diversity, inequality, and inclusion policies seem to be disappearing, and the fact that the natives are still being mistreated, wronged, and harmed in this country. Now, some of you have watched my transformation in my thinking about all of this, and I would say that most of it started at the GA conference in New Orleans in 2017. And you've been watching me as I try to live a more thoughtful life about the individuals around us and how we treat them and how they've been treated and how they're still being treated. And I don't always get it right. But then one time I was here at the church, and somebody who had been wearing a Black Lives Matter button forever stopped wearing it suddenly. And I questioned, I said, well, why aren't you wearing your button anymore? And they told me that the reason why they didn't wear it anymore, because they weren't actively doing anything to help support Black Lives Matter. They weren't actually participating. It was like hoping that something would change without the action, or as Rev used to say, hope without action is just wishful thinking. So I thought a lot about that. And I also think about that in terms of our land acknowledgement that we do every week. So our land acknowledgement is just a part of the equation, and we have 4 or 5 people that are actively working on revising our land acknowledgement. And that's led by Joan and Marilee, and Lucy's helping, and so is Liz, for sure. They're doing the work with Reverend Stacy. And this is what they've come up with so far. And if you just indulge me for a minute, I think they're doing a great job. I'm really impressed with the work they're doing. We acknowledge that our UU Fellowship stands on the lands that once were the part of the hunting and gathering grounds that sustained the Mechoopda people from the beginnings on these ancestral lands. We are mindful that the culture, livelihood, and lives of the Mechoopda people and their descendants were devastated, being forever altered by the actions of others, and that the heritage of the Mechoopda must be honored and remembered by all members of our community. May we extend the hand of friendship to all of the Mechoopda heritage and to others of Native ancestry to acknowledge the pain of the changes and hardship thrust upon them and promote mutual love and understanding and their support. Well, back in 2020, the UU did a social witness, and they do social witnesses at every GA where they make they see a problem. That was the way we've been treating Native people from the beginning, and they go ahead and they come up with a statement, actions that need to be done, and it's long. So, but part of it has been boiled down to 4 areas. Do we know the history of the land of our congregation that we call home? Check, we've done that. Lucy and those guys have done a really good job at research. Do you know what the Indigenous people historically or currently inhabit that land? Well, we're doing that. A lot of the research did that. But then it comes to the last 2 points. Do you know who the Indigenous people or communities who live in your area or region and what their vision and struggles are? I don't know that we do that so good at all. Working on it. And what action in relationship or solidarity with any of them? Well, for me personally, I don't think that we're doing anything yet. So I have to look this is me personally, when I see a land acknowledgement, when I was at the women's storytelling the other day and they did a land acknowledgement, I want to know what they're doing behind that land acknowledgement, because it just becomes pretty rote. It just becomes, oh, I've said it. I've just taken care, check that off. And we can't go and tell them what to do. We have to be allies. And allies start, with, acknowledging the issues and the problems and the situation. And then the next step is taking action. Because if we want to keep hoping that things are changing, as Rev said, then that's just wishful thinking. So for me, the question is, what will I do? How can I be a better ally than the natives in my area? Thank you. The following is from Ho Chung. United Church of Christ Fellowship, summarizing the stories passed down to them about the doctrines of discovery. We were told that God has declared the Pope rules all people, regardless of their law, sect, or belief. This includes Christians, Moors, Jews, Gentiles, or any other sects. Native Americans were to come forward of their own free will to convert to Catholicism, or with the help of God, we shall use force against you, declaring war upon you from all sides with all possible means. And we shall bind you to the yoke of the church and their highness. We shall enslave your persons, wives, sons, sell you or dispose of you as the king sees fit. We shall seize your possessions and harm you as much as we can, as disobedience and resisting vassals. Furthermore, natives resist are to be held guilty of all resulting deaths and injuries from the just war waged against them. That was the story of the doctrine. And that's the reason.
2018. At the opening night's worship, we sang together, Doctrine of Discovery, we renounce as heresy. Now God is healing history with justice and love. Now, as skeptical as I was of organized religion, somewhere in my hyper-rationalistic heart, I was moved. I mean, I was feeling spiritual in this worship service in ways that I rarely do in an American Protestant church. We were this huge auditorium, hundreds of people in direct encounter with what is often called America's original sin, racism. And here we were in worship and business, taking steps towards reconciliation. This, the UCC, perhaps you are familiar with them. There is the joke, the Unitarians considering Christ. There's a lot in common with UU. Unitarian Universalists and the United Church of Christ are both governed by congregational polity. So in both traditions, delegates from fellowships vote on the resolutions, on the collective work in a democratic process that then the whole helps to move forward. So in this case, the resolution was to be voted on to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. And it was brought forward by this United Church of Christ Ho Chunk Church that is in Wisconsin that had been sharing their story. So I was really excited. What Angela just read was something that I just knew we had to take action on. And as I reviewed the resolution, I realized that I had come here and I was mistaken. Yes, I realized that we were not voting to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. We were voting on whether or not to do a year-long study on the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. I was stunned and I was really angry. I mean, study it? This is the most liberal, social justice-oriented, action-oriented Christian denomination in the world, and we're going to think about it? How about let's just make a little Facebook group? I just didn't understand what more it would take before we were pounding our fists, stomping our feet. Oh, wait, we were. We renounce it as heresy. That's what we were singing. So I took a breath. Now, I've been a community organizer in other jobs, and I know that changing hearts and minds is not happening in a large auditorium where you take a vote and then say we did it. That doesn't change anything. Education, walking in the shoes, hearing different perspectives, understanding implicit biases, these things can change behaviors. So yes, I voted yes to study the doctrine of discovery for a year. And I got to engage in community with that study. And what I learned over that year was that many people have never been taught about the doctrine of discovery. Some have been taught, but only from the point of view of those who were most benefited by it. It is so intertwined. It is a lifelong learning topic, and it needs to be part of community conversation again and again to be aware of its not historical, but current impacts on our lives today. I hope today's message, whether you are new to the study of the doctrine of discovery or have thoroughly examined it, provides opportunity to wonder. What does repudiation mean? Repudiation, to deny the truth of something. What does it mean to repudiate the doctrine of discovery for our shared humanity today? I come to you humbled to share my perspectives, which will be subjectively filtered through my social location. I can't help that. As a white, middle-class, middle-aged, Midwestern American brought up in the Protestant church, but in the UU fellowship now, I am both limited by and fueled by my unique perspectives and experiences. But I have learned from people with very different social locations, and I do not speak for them, but I share the learning and my own experience in being changed by learning from them about the doctrine of discovery. So what am I even talking about? What is this doctrine of discovery? Well, in the 1400s, as European monarchies went on expeditions encountering lands and cultures no other European nation had reached, they asked the Pope, what should we do? Do we have the rights to the riches of these lands? Do we have a duty to share Christianity with these people? And honestly, I've seen some of the original sources of these letters, and they really are asking for guidance. You know, they're really beseeching, like, what do we do? And Pope Nicholas V wrote a papal bull, which is a statement on behalf of the Catholic Church, which read, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his, capital H, his, and to their use and profit. Now, another papal bull was added in 1493. Now, let's see, what was happening in 1493? Oh, yeah, that's when Christopher Columbus returned to Spain after getting lost at sea. So this bull clarified that any land not inhabited by Christians, any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and ruled. And you're hearing that language in today's reading that Angela shared. If you resist, the just war waged against you is your fault. These and the other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493 collectively became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And while it originated within the Catholic Church, it became the guide for Catholic and Protestants alike. That term discovery implies that the people discovered were not actually fully there, right? They were not equal to the ones who were doing the discovering. Now, some will use the term Europeans as synonymous with the doctrine of discovery, but I argue that it is actually synonymous with Christendom. Christendom, Christian empire, that says God elects some with special status, and those people can treat another as less human, even as property. Some can own the land and govern the land, and others who cannot, because of the social construct of race, because of their religion. This mindset established the US Constitution, which clarifies that women and Native Americans are not considered people with rights, and African Americans count as 3/5 of a person. One source of Christendom are texts in the Old Testament, referred to as conquest narratives. One of these is the fall of Jericho in the book of Joshua. So for context, you have the Israelites fleeing slavery in the book of Exodus. They have wandered through the desert, holding a promise given to their ancestors that they are going to the promised land, a land of milk and honey, book of Numbers. And then we get to the book of Joshua, where we hear of the fall of Jericho. They've crossed the Jordan River, and they are in the lands of Canaan, and they march upon the city of Jericho, and just by marching around the outside walls and blowing their horns and singing their songs, on the seventh day, the walls come crumbling down and the city is theirs. Moses' successor, Joshua, acquires the land of Canaan for the people of Israel, and it is understood that the acquisition of the land is a gift of God, who battles with them and for them. Joshua chapter 1, verse 3 reads, every place that your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. And chapter 24, verse 13 reads, I give you a land on which you have not labored, and towns that you have not built, and you live in them. You eat the vineyards, you eat fruit of vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant. So whose land was this? Yes, the Canaanites. Christendom Europeans identified with the Israelites, writing conquest into the doctrine of discovery, recreating this narrative again and again as they went to new lands. And that included enslaving, killing, and converting the people who were already there. It's so problematic theologically, it's so problematic ecclesiastically, and it's so problematic historically. I mean, first of all, there's just a lot of differences in the book of Joshua that was likely written around the 13th century before the Common Era, BCE, or some people call BC, and the expansion of Christendom in the 15th century CE, thousands of years. Given the significance of the Jericho story, multiple archaeological expeditions have been launched, mainly through Christian funding, to verify this story, to show the conquest that happened, to document it. And what they have found, if the city was there at all, is that Jericho was a small, poor, unwalled village. More likely, it was an uninhabited ruin when they discovered it. This story, which has led to the dehumanization, genocide, and enslavement of Indigenous peoples across the world through a Christian interpretation, is a story. And it isn't just any story, it is the story of a minority people, the Israelites, escaping enslavement, wandering the desert in starvation, and arriving to the place that they believed was meant to be their home. It is the Hebrew Bible story. The stories in the book of Joshua are not historical. They are theological. They are a dialogue, an oral tradition of people trying to find meaning and inspiration for survival. The actual moral of the story, as I was taught by an amazing teacher, is that Yahweh fulfills promises, not go conquer lands. Native American scholars have helped to provide a kind of concur with this minority perspective. They write that they understand the language in this narrative because it is the warrior language. It is what many of their stories tell when a small, less resourced groups needs inspiration and encouragement to do something that cannot be done. I was once at a rally and the organizer said, "We will march, we will shout, and we will not quit until we shall end childhood hunger for all." And we all said yes. And of course, we went home that evening and childhood hunger was not ended. Another famous organizer once said, "I have a dream that one day even every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, and rough places will be made plain." I mean, there's still rough mountains out there. It is most probable within the context of the book of Joshua that the fall of Jericho is the language, just like in these examples, of something we fight for, something we believe in, even when it's insurmountable, yet must be so. So what happens when a world superpower with huge military and financial powers takes that narrative, takes a minority's narrative, and uses it as their own? Every single time, it's like a world power gaining supernatural powers, where they believe it is their divine right and they literally have the resources to do almost unbelievable abusive things. And every time somebody with power co-opts a minority's story, it's always abusive. It's like a divine blessing for unlimited abuse against others. Now, I have a lot of love for Christianity, don't get me wrong, but none for Christendom. I cannot reconcile the story of Christ with the doctrine of discovery, that the European monarchies were destined to discover lands and convert the peoples. I cannot understand Christian empire. But yet today, many Christians believe that Christianity and Christendom are synonymous. And so it was with the doctrine of discovery. Many good, decent people in Europe were taught that these lands, what we now call the United States of America, were the promised lands, the new Canaan. God would make it so, they were taught in their religious circles. Now, how would you act with a promise like that? And how do we know this? How can I get into their minds? Well, they kind of named the places they dwelled. Cities named Canaan or New Canaan are found in Vermont, Maine, New York, Connecticut, West Virginia, and countless roads and counties and schools also bear that name especially in the New England area. So, as this is all happening in was then called the colonies, in 1763, King George draws a line straight down the Appalachian Mountains and declares that the colonies don't have the right to discover any land west of that line. The colonies organized and wrote a letter of protest saying that they had the right to discover these lands, and they sent it and signed it on July 4th, 1776. Yes, that is the context of the Declaration of Independence. And of course, this was followed by the development of the Constitution, which again clarified who was and wasn't considered we the people, that intersection of gender, race, and class. But this was followed by the Revolutionary War. Winning independence from the monarchy could have been the moment to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, but instead, it went a different direction. Two men of European descent both had claims to the same piece of land, and they went to the fledgling Supreme Court and asked who actually had the rights to this land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other got the land from the government. And they wanted to know who owned it, who had the rights to it, and who had the right to sell it. This case is called Johnson versus McIntosh, and it goes all the way to this fledgling Supreme Court, which ruled that discovery gave title to the land. And this established precedent in this country, which still stands today, that land titles are based on. The case references the doctrine of discovery and states that Indigenous people were here first, but are less than human, so they only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land. Like a deer would occupy the land. Europeans have the right of discovery of the land. So the fee title is something that can only be held by a true title holder, one who can discover it. One of the associate justices on the Supreme Court at this time of the trial was Joseph Story, who was also the president of the American Unitarian Association. This is no longer a Catholic papal bull, folks. It is now the law of the land. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005. Let me tell you a little bit about that story. The city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York was a Supreme Court case in which the court held that when the Oneida Nation purchased their original tribal lands back on the open market, paying full price, that they did not restore tribal sovereignty to those lands because of the doctrine of discovery. And who wrote for this case? Oh my gosh, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She wrote the majority opinion. Despite often ruling in ways that were anti-oppressive, she loved the law and said this was the correct interpretation of the law. And there is so much at stake because one of the reasons why this was taken up by the Supreme Court is because Indigenous-owned lands that are sovereign are not taxable by the US government. So it had a really big impact in that region. Now, not every SCOTUS case has gone this way. The Sioux Nation won their Supreme Court case. Yes, the Fort Laramie Treaty gave them ownership of the Black Hills, the Pahasapa, to the Sioux Nation. Now, the government reneged on this treaty in 1874, the year after gold was discovered in French Creek. Yes, Custer, Battle of Wounded Knee, 1890. You probably know the history. In 1980, in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the court agreed that this was their land, that the treaty still stood. Now, as I understand it, the Sioux Nation offered a compromise, which allowed all private land in private land ownership to remain, but all public lands, such as state parks and U.S. Forest Service, would become the property of the Sioux Nation. And the court said no. but they would compensate the tribe for the land at $600 million. The tribe said no, but that is what the court ruled. So that amount, as I understand it, still sits in a bank account, untouched, accruing interest, and it's to the tune of over $1 billion today. The Sioux Nation says, no way. You said the land was ours, and that's what we want. It doesn't have a price. Have you ever been to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation? I have. They won't take the money. Now, every time I speak about the doctrine of discovery, at the end of the talk, somebody asks the important question. Territorial disputes have always been violent. Throughout human history, there are accounts of battles and oppression over land. This is just the way things are. What makes this one so special, so different? It's too complicated to do something about at this point. I'm not ignorant to these facts, but for me, this is a crisis of faith. Am I really supposed to accept a white supremacist theology that is literally rooted into the land and into the relationship to land ownership in this country? That isn't my faith. It's actually the opposite. I am called to equity, and the basis of the doctrine of discovery is inequality. I am called to justice, and the presence of the doctrine of discovery is a prison wall, and I don't know if I am on the inside or the outside of that prison. I am called to live into the simple truth of being just one small part of the interdependent web of life, and so I ask, what about we, the people? Do you feel called to this as well? For many, it is a crisis of faith. In 2023, the Vatican repudiates those concepts that fail to recognize the inherent human right of Indigenous peoples, including what has become known as the legal and political doctrine of discovery. The Episcopalian Church in 2009 was the first Christian denomination from a world perspective to pass a resolution repudiating the doctrine of discovery. The United Church of Christ did the same thing in 2013, the United Methodist Church in 2012, the Mennonite Church, the Quakers, the World Council of Churches. The Unitarian Universalism has been doing this work for over 45 years. Perhaps some of you will find a little bit of hope in these examples because things are changing, although slowly. The first one I just wanted to point out is called rights of nature. This is the practice of granting personhood, rights of being to ecosystems, such as rivers, fields, mountains, and lakes. And especially in tribal courts, it may be possible to establish a precedent where those who harm the land, wildlife, and waters are held to the same consequences of someone who commits, say, homicide, or perhaps treason. After all, when we say clean water is a human right, aren't we still giving special status to humans over the rest of the interdependent web of life? At General Assembly, Rights of Nature panelists explained that humans are infantile. We have just emerged evolutionarily, and we are still parasitic on our Mother Earth. Like all species, we will either evolve into symbiotic and eventually mutualistic, living, giving systems if we are going to survive and thrive, because parasites will kill their mothers. We can look to our great-grandmother Sequoia for guidance. We can ask our Auntie Snow Goose for ideas. We are what we eat, so be like mushrooms, a universe of connections, carrying nourishment, sensitive and resilient. Land Back. Land Back is an Indigenous rights movement, a political organizing framework to restore Indigenous rights across Turtle Island. In just last year, in 2024, the Minnesota State Park, which was called the Upper Sioux Agency State Park, about 1,400 acres, was the first state park ever returned to an Indigenous people. They returned it to the Dakota people. And Governor Walz wrote this at the time. After years of work, I am grateful to mark the official return of this land to the Yellow Medicine Dakota people. In 2019, Chairman Kevin Jensvold shared with me the history and significance of this land to the Yellow Medicine people. Together as partners, tribal, state, and federal, we work to return the land to its original caretakers. This isn't us doing a right thing. We are simply undoing the wrong thing. Just about 20 miles from where I'm standing today, the Bad River Tribal Reservation won a recent land back case. The Dawes Act allowed lands designated as reservations to be sold to private landowners. And in the Bad River Reservation, for years, they've worked as a tribe to buy those lands back. And when they bought them back, they were still paying taxes on them, just like we heard in the case from New York. However, they appealed to the state court, which said that they were being unlawfully taxed, that they not only would no longer have to pay taxes on those lands, but they needed the money to be returned from the state to the people for all the years that they had owned the lands. Now, this is actually a crisis. I mean, my nearest neighbors, they are, looking at a doubling of their property tax bill because 50% of the land in a small municipal area was just taken off of the tax rolls. The state is working on it. The region is working on it. But it is tricky. It is absolutely tricky. And it means things like roads and culverts and things like that are not able to be repaired right now. There's a lot about national parks that are managed with tribes, including the Grand Portage National Monument in northern Minnesota, the Canyon de Shelly National Monument in Arizona, and Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. There are lots of examples of how this is happening, and it is happening mainly in the courts. But the doctrine of discovery creates a spiritual framework in addition to the legal framework that continues today. This is the seed that's planted so deep in this country that instead of ripping it out by its roots, we've just come to expect and tolerate the strange fruit it bears. And of course, things like DEI, diversity, equity, this disrupts this whole concept of the doctrine of discovery, which disrupts land ownership, which disrupts what is such an economic driver in this country. Accepting responsibility for wrongs is a religious idea. And without religion in motion in modern culture and goodwill behind that motion, social change will likely only come through legal measures. It is no wonder that when visiting with the United Nation in Wisconsin and I asked about their hope for the future, they said that their hope is that more of their young people will become lawyers and then come back and work for their tribes. Religion in motion has the potential to plant a new seed of compassion and true kinship in this country. To take action is to love the earth, to know it is a republic unto itself. So let us march, let us blow our horns and let the walls come tumbling down. The walls with block which has been from what can be, the walls that enclose us in fear, in the spirit of poverty, trying to protect what is mine, instead of the spirit of generosity, which allows us to become we the people of the United States. Amen. May it be so. And thank you so much.
Hey,